Hey, my name's Otis Gray, and you're listening to Sleepy, a podcast where I read old books to help you get to sleep. Tonight, I have a really great story for you. Now that spooky October is over, and we can move back to some of our more romantic, wistful stories and slow down and move away from the spookiness and into kind of a more fall-y autumn holiday vibe. So that's what we're going to do tonight with one of our favorite authors, Nathaniel Hawthorne. And before we get to the bedtime reading, I just want to take a moment to thank all of our brand new patrons on patreon.com, which is a website where you can go and pledge a couple bucks for an ad-free version of Sleepy. So, this week's incredible new patrons: Trinity Chaos, Richard Gagnon, Diane Kedge, Cheryl, January Lynn Martin, and Peggy. Thank you all so much for being a part of making the show. It really means a lot. So thank you. And if you're hearing this and you have no idea what these names are that I just read, these are all brand new supporters of Sleepy on patreon.com, which is just a website that allows you to directly support the people who make the stuff that you like. So if you like Sleepy, maybe it's helped you get a better night's rest, and maybe you want to just be directly a part of making it, you can do that by going to patreon.com/sleepyradio and donating even $1 a month. So a lot of people give, and it really goes a long way. At $2 a month, like I said, that gets you an ad-free version of Sleepy. $5, you get access to our poetry feed. But no matter how much you donate, it really means a lot. And even with $1, I will read your name on the credits of our next Sunday show after you do, just like I did all these names today. So if you would like to be a part of making the show, you can go to patreon.com/sleepyradio and donate even $1. So thank you. And as always, the music you're hearing is by my good friend James Lepkowski, and the cover art for Sleepy is by Gracie Kanan. So, now that spooky October has wrapped, a bunch of really delightful and creepier stories, we are moving on to some more wistful, calmed down, romantic stories, ones that are really easy to get lost in, ones that are a little bit more methodical and about relationships and love and maybe adventure and reflection. And I can think of no way to better get back in this mood than by reading some of Nathaniel Hawthorne, who is one of my absolute favorite writers of all time. And I've read him a lot on the show over these 460 something episodes so far, but it's been a while. So we're going to bring back some Nathaniel Hawthorne tonight and read the first few chapters of this wonderful book that he wrote, which is very kind of methodical and rhythmic and a little bit heady, to be honest. It's really easy to get lost in. I definitely got lost reading it, so I hope you get lost enough to fall asleep to it. So, without further ado, this is The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And now is the time for you to fluff up your pillow just how you like it. Feel yourself melt into your bed. Get real comfortable, and let me read to you. Chapter 1. Old Moody. The evening before my departure for Blythedale, I was returning to my bachelor apartments after attending the wonderful exhibition of The Veiled Lady, when an elderly man of rather shabby appearance met me in an obscure part of the street. "Mr. Coverdale," said he softly, "can I speak with you a moment?" As I have casually alluded to The Veiled Lady, it may not be amiss to mention, for the benefit of such of my readers as are unacquainted with her now forgotten celebrity, that she was a phenomenon in the mesmeric line, one of the earliest that had indicated the birth of a new science or the revival of an old humbug. Since those times, her sisterhood have grown too numerous to attract much individual notice, nor in fact has any one of them come before the public under such skillfully contrived circumstances of stage effect as those which at once mystified and illuminated the remarkable performances of the lady in question. Nowadays, in the management of his subject, clairvoyant or medium, the exhibitor affects the simplicity and openness of scientific experiment, and even if he profess to tread a step or two across the boundaries of the spiritual world, yet carries with him the laws of our actual life and extends them over his preternatural conquests. 12 or 15 years ago, on the contrary, all of the arts of mysterious arrangement, of picturesque disposition, and artistically contrasted light and shade were made available in order to set the apparent miracle in the strongest attitude of opposition to ordinary facts. In the case of the Veiled Lady, moreover, the interest of the spectator was further wrought up by the enigma of her identity, and an absurd rumor, probably set afloat by the exhibitor, at one time very prevalent, that a beautiful young lady of family and fortune was enshrouded within the misty drapery of the veil. It was white, with somewhat of a subdued silver screen, like the sunny side of a cloud, and falling over the wearer from head to foot was supposed to insulate her from the material world, from time and space, and to endow her with many of the privileges of a disembodied spirit. Her pretensions, however, whether miraculous or otherwise, have little to do with the present narrative, except indeed that I had propounded, for the Veiled Lady's prophetic solution, a query as to the success of our Blythedale enterprise. The response, by and by, was of the true Sibylline stamp, nonsensical in its first aspect, yet on closer study, unfolding a variety of interpretations, one of which has certainly accorded with the event. I was turning over this riddle in my mind and trying to catch its slippery purport by the tail when the old man above mentioned interrupted me. "Mr. Coverdale, Mr. Coverdale," said he, repeating my name twice in order to make up for the hesitating and ineffectual way in which he uttered it. "I ask your pardon, sir, but I hear you are going to Blythedale tomorrow." I knew the pale, elderly face with the red-tipped nose, the patch over one eye, and likewise saw something characteristic in the old fellow's way of standing under the arch of a gate, only revealing enough of himself to make me recognize him as an acquaintance. He was a very shy personage, this Mr. Moody, and the trait was the more singular, as his mode of getting his bread necessarily brought him into the stir and hubbub of the world more than the generality of men. "Yes, Mr. Moody," I answered, wondering what interest he could take in the fact. "It is my intention to go to Blythedale tomorrow. Can I be of any service to you before my departure?" If you pleased, Mr. Coverdale, said he, you might do me a very great favor. A very great one, repeated I, in a tone that must have expressed but little alacrity of beneficence, although I was ready to do the old man any amount of kindness involving no special trouble to myself. A very great favor, do you say? My time is brief, Mr. Moody, and I have a good many preparations to make. But be good enough to tell me what you wish. Ah, sir, replied old Moody, I don't quite like to do that. And on further thoughts, Mr. Coverdale, perhaps I had better apply to some older gentleman, or to some lady, if you would have the kindness to make me known to one, who may happen to be going to Blythedale. You are a young man, sir. Does that fact lessen my availability for your purpose? Asked I. However, if an older man will suit you better, there is Mr. Hollingsworth, who has 3 or 4 years the advantage of me in age, and is a much more solid character, and a philanthropist to boot. I am only a poet, and, so the critics tell me, no great affair at that. But what can this business be, Mr. Moody? It begins to interest me, especially since your hint that a lady's influence might be found desirable. Come, I am really anxious to be of service to you. But the old fellow, in his civil and demure manner, was both freakish and obstinate, and he had now taken some notion or other into his head that made him hesitate in his former design. I wonder, sir, said he, whether you know a lady they call Zenobia. Not personally, I answered, although I expect that pleasure tomorrow, as she has got the start on the rest of us, and is already resident at Blythedale. But have you a literary turn, Mr. Moody? Or have you taken up the advocacy of women's rights? Or what else can have interested you in this lady? Zenobia, by and by, as I suppose you know, is merely her public name, a sort of mask in which she comes before the world, retaining all the privileges of privacy, a contrivance, in short, like the white drapery of the veiled lady, only a little more transparent. But it is late. Will you tell me what I can do for you? Please to excuse me tonight, Mr. Coverdale, said Mr. Moody. You are very kind, but I am afraid I have troubled you, when after all, there may be no need. Perhaps with your good leave, I will come to your lodgings tomorrow morning, before you set out for Blythedale. I wish you a good night, sir, and beg your pardon for stopping you. And so he slipped away, and as he did not show himself the next morning, it was only through subsequent events that I ever arrived at a plausible conjecture as to what his business could have been. Arriving at my room, I threw a lump of cannel coal upon the grate, lighted a cigar, and spent an hour in musings of every hue, from the brightest to the most somber, being, in truth, not so very confident as at some former periods that this final step, which would mix me up irrevocably with the Blythedale affair, was the wisest that could possibly be taken. It was nothing short of midnight when I went to bed, after drinking a glass of particularly fine sherry, on which I used to pride myself in those days. It was the very last bottle, and I finished it with a friend the next forenoon before setting out for Blythedale. Chapter 2. Blythedale. There can hardly remain for me, who am really getting to be a frosty bachelor, with another white hair every week or so in my mustache, there can hardly flicker up again so cheery a blaze upon the hearth as that which I remember the next day at Blythedale. It was a wood fire in the parlor of an old farmhouse on an April afternoon, but with the fitful gusts of a wintry snowstorm roaring in the chimney. Vividly does the fireside recreate itself as I rake away the ashes from the embers in my memory and blow them up with a sigh for lack of more inspiring breath. Vividly, for an instant, but anon, with the dimmest gleam, and with just as little fervency for my heart as for the finger ends. The staunch oaken logs were long ago burnt out. Their genial glow must be represented, if at all, by the merest phosphoric glimmer, like that which exudes, rather than shines, from damp fragments of decayed trees, deluding the benighted wanderer through a forest. Around such chill mockery of a fire, some few of us might sit on the withered leaves, spreading out each a palm towards the imaginary warmth, and talk over our exploded scheme for beginning the life of paradise anew. Paradise, indeed. Nobody else in the world. I am bold to affirm, nobody, at least, in our bleak little world of New England, had dreamed of paradise that day, except as the poles suggest the tropic. Nor, with such materials as were at hand, could the most skillful architect have constructed any better imitation of Eve's bower that might be seen in the snow hut of an Eskimo. But we made a summer of it, in spite of the wild drifts. It was an April day, as already hinted, and well towards the middle of the month, when morning dawned upon me in town. Its temperature was mild enough to be pronounced even balmy by a lodger like myself in one of the midmost houses of a brick block, each house partaking the warmth of all the rest, besides the sultriness of its individual furnace, heat. But towards noon, there had come snow, driven along the street by a northeasterly blast, and whitening the roofs and sidewalks with a business-like perseverance that would have done credit to our severest January tempest. It set about its task, apparently, as much in earnest as if it had been guaranteed from a thaw for months to come. The greater, surely, was my heroism, when puffing out a final whiff of cigar smoke, I quitted my cozy pair of bachelor rooms, with a good fire burning in the grate, and a closet right at hand, where there was still a bottle or two in the champagne basket, and the residuum of claret in a box. Quitted, I say, these comfortable quarters, and plunged into the heart of the pitiless snowstorm in quest of a better life. The better life. Possibly, it would hardly look so now. It is enough if it looked so then. The greatest obstacle to being heroic is the doubt whether one may not be going to prove oneself a fool. The truest heroism is to resist the doubt, and the profoundest wisdom to know when it ought to be resisted and when to be obeyed. Yet after all, let us acknowledge it wiser, if not more sagacious, to follow out one's daydream to its natural consummation, although, if the vision had been worth the having, it is certain never to be consummated otherwise than by a failure. And what of that? Its airiest fragments, impalpable as they may be, will possess a value that lurks not in the most ponderous realities of any practicable scheme. They are not the rubbish of the mind. Whatever else I may repent of, therefore, let it be reckoned neither among my sins nor follies that I once had faith and force enough to form generous hopes of the world's destiny. Yes, and to do what in me lay for their accomplishment, even to the extent of quitting a warm fireside, flinging away a freshly lighted cigar, and traveling far beyond the strike of city blocks through a drifting snowstorm. There were 4 of us who rode together through the storm, and Hollingsworth, who had agreed to be of the number, was accidentally delayed, and set forth at a later hour alone. As we threaded the streets, I remember how the buildings on either side seemed to press too closely upon us, insomuch that our mighty hearts found barely room enough to throb between them. The snowfall, too, looked inexpressibly dreary. I had almost called it dingy, coming down through an atmosphere of city smoke and alighting on the sidewalk, only to be molded into the impress of somebody's patched boot or overshoe. Thus the track of an old conventionalism was visible on what was freshest from the sky. But when we left the pavements and our muffled hoof tramps beat upon a desolate extent of country road and were effaced by the unfettered blast as soon as stamped, then there was better air to breathe. Air that had not been breathed once and again, air that had not been spoken into words of falsehood, formality, and error, like all the air of the dusky city. "How pleasant it is," remarked I, while the snowflakes flew into my mouth the moment it was opened. "How very mild and balmy is the country air." "Ah, Coverdale, don't laugh at what little enthusiasm you have left," said one of my companions. "I maintain that this nitrous atmosphere is really exhilarating, and at any rate, we can never call ourselves regenerated men till a February nor'easter shall be as grateful to us as the softest breeze of June." So we all of us took courage, riding fleetly and merrily along by the stone fences that were half buried in the wave like drifts, and through patches of woodland where the tree trunks opposed a snow-encrusted side toward the northeast, and within ken of deserted villas with no footprints in their avenues and pressed scattered dwellings, whence puffed the smoke of country fires, strongly impregnated with the pungent aroma of burning peat. Sometimes, encountering a traveler, we shouted a friendly greeting, and he, unmuffling his ears to the bluster and the snowy prey, and listening eagerly, appeared to think our courtesy worth less than the trouble which it cost him. The churl! He understood the shrill whistle of the blast, but had no intelligence for our blithe tones of brotherhood. This lack of faith in our cordial sympathy on the traveler's part was one among the innumerable tokens how difficult a task we had in hand for the reformation of the world. We rode on, however, with still unflagging spirits, and made such good companionship with the tempest that, at our journey's end, we professed ourselves almost loath to bid the rude blusterer good-bye. But to own the truth, I was little better than an icicle, and began to be suspicious that I had caught a fearful cold. And now we were seated by the brisk fireside of the old farmhouse, the same fire that glimmers so faintly among my reminiscences at the beginning of this chapter. There we sat, with the snow melting out of our hair and beards, and our faces all ablaze, what with the past inclemency and present warmth. It was indeed a right good fire that we found awaiting us, built up of great rough logs and knotty limbs and splintered fragments of an oak tree, such as farmers are wont to keep for their own hearths, since these crooked and unmanageable boughs could never be measured into merchantable cords for the market. A family of old pilgrims might have swung their kettle over precisely such a fire as this, only no doubt a bigger one. And contrasting it with my coal grate, I felt so much the more that we had transported ourselves a worldwide distance from the system of society that shackled us at breakfast time. Good, comfortable Mrs. Foster, the wife of stout Silas Foster, who was to manage the farm at a fair stipend and be our tutor in the art of husbandry, bade us a hearty welcome. At her back, a back of generous breadth, appeared two young women, smiling most hospitably, but looking rather awkward withal, as not well knowing what was to be their position in our new arrangement of the world. We shook hands affectionately all around, and congratulated ourselves that the blessed state of brotherhood and sisterhood at which we aimed might fairly be dated from this moment. Our greetings were hardly concluded when the door opened and Zenobia, whom I had never before seen, important as was her place in our enterprise, Zenobia entered the parlor. This, as the reader, if at all acquainted with our literary biography, need scarcely be told, was not her real name. She had assumed it, in the first instance, as her magazine signature, and as it accorded well with something imperial which her friends attributed to this lady's figure and deportment, they half laughingly adopted it in their familiar intercourse with her. She took the appellation in good part, and even encouraged its constant use, which, in fact, was thus far appropriate, that our Zenobia, however humble looked her new philosophy, had as much native pride as any queen would have known what to do with. Chapter 3. A Knot of Dreamers. Zenobia bade us welcome in a fine, frank, mellow voice, and gave each of us her hand, which was very soft and warm. She had something appropriate, I recollect, to say to every individual, and what she said to myself was this: I have long wished to know you, Mr. Coverdale, and to thank you for your beautiful poetry, some of which I have learned by heart, or rather, it is stolen into my memory, without my exercising any choice or volition about the matter. Of course, permit me to say, you do not think of relinquishing an occupation in which you have done yourself so much credit. I would almost rather give you up as an associate than that the world should lose one of its truest poets. Ah, no, there will not be the slightest danger of that, especially after this inestimable praise from Zenobia, said I, smiling, and blushing, no doubt, with excess of pleasure. I hope, on the contrary, now to produce something that shall really deserve to be called poetry, true, strong, natural, and sweet, as is the life which we are going to lead, something that shall have notes of wild birds twittering through it, or a strain like the wind anthems in the woods, as the case may be. It is irksome to you to hear your own verses sung, asked Zenobia, with a gracious smile. If so, I am very sorry, for you will certainly hear me singing them sometimes in the summer evenings. Of all things, answered I, that is what will delight me the most. While this passed, and while she spoke to my companions, I was taking note of Zenobia's aspect, and it impressed itself on me so distinctly that I can now summon her up like a ghost, a little wanner than the life, but otherwise identical with it. She was dressed as simply as possible in an American print. I think the dry goods people call it so, but with a silken kerchief, between which and her gown there was one glimpse of a white shoulder. It struck me as a great piece of good fortune that there should be just that glimpse. Her hair, which was dark, glossy, and of singular abundance, was put up rather soberly and primly, without curls or other ornament, except a single flower. It was an exotic of rare beauty, and as fresh as if the hothouse gardener had just clipped it from the stem. That flower has struck deep root into my memory. I can both see it and smell it at this moment. So brilliant, so rare, so costly as it must have been, and yet enduring only for a day. It was more indicative of the pride and pomp which had luxuriant growth in Zenobia's character than if a great diamond had sparkled among her hair. Her hand, though very soft, was larger than most women would like to have, or than they could afford to have, though not a whit too large in proportion with the spacious plan of Zenobia's entire development. It did one good to see a fine intellect, as hers really was, although its natural tendency lay in another direction than towards literature, so fitly cased. She was, indeed, an admirable figure of a woman, just on the hither verge of her richest maturity, with a combination of features which it is safe to call remarkably beautiful, even if some fastidious persons might pronounce them a little deficient in softness and delicacy. But we find enough of those attributes everywhere. Preferable, by way of variety at least, was Zenobia's bloom, health, and vigor, which she possessed in such overflow that a man might well have fallen in love with her for their sake only. In her quiet moods, she seemed rather indolent, but when really in earnest, particularly if there were a spice of bitter feelings, she grew all alive to her fingertips. "I am the first comer," Zenobia went on to say, while her smile beamed warmth upon us all. "So I take the part of hostess for today, and welcome you as if to my own fireside. You shall be guests, too, at supper. Tomorrow, if you please, we will be brethren and sisters and begin our new life from daybreak." "Have we our various parts assigned?" asked someone. "Oh, we are the softer sex," responded Zenobia, with her mellow, almost broad laugh. "Most delectable to hear, but not in the least like an ordinary woman's laugh. We women, there are 4 of us here already, will take the domestic and indoor part of the business as a matter of course. To bake, to boil, to roast, to fry, to stew, to wash and iron, and scrub and sweep, and at our idler intervals, to repose ourselves on knitting and sewing. These, I suppose, must be feminine occupations for the present. By and by, perhaps, when our individual adaptations begin to develop themselves, it may be that some of us who wear the petticoat will go afield and leave the weaker brethren to take our places in the kitchen." "What a pity," I remarked, "that the kitchen and the housework generally cannot be left out of our system altogether. It is odd enough that the kind of labor which falls to the lot of women is just that which chiefly distinguishes artificial life, the life of degenerated mortals, from the life of paradise. Eve had no dinner pot, and no clothes to mend, and no washing day. I am afraid, said Zenobia, with mirth gleaming out of her eyes, we shall find some difficulty in adopting the paradisical system for at least a month to come. Look at that snowdrift sweeping past the window. Are there any figs ripe, do you think? Have the pineapples been gathered today? Would you like a breadfruit or a coconut? Shall I run out and pluck you some roses? No, Mr. Coverdale. The only flower hereabouts is the one in my hair, which I got out of a greenhouse this morning. As for the garb of Eden, added she, shivering playfully, I shall not assume it till after May Day. Assuredly, Zenobia could not have intended it. The fall must have been entirely in my imagination. But these last words, together with something in her manner, irresistibly brought up a picture of that fine, perfectly developed figure in Eve's earliest garment. Her free, careless, generous modes of expression often had this effect of creating images, which, though pure, I hardly felt to be quite decorous when born of a thought that passes between man and woman. I imputed it, at the time, to Zenobia's noble courage, conscious of no harm, and scorning the pretty restraints which take the life and color out of other women's conversation. There was another peculiarity about her. We seldom meet with women nowadays, and in this country, who impress us as being women at all. Their sex fades away and goes for nothing in ordinary intercourse. Not so with Zenobia. One felt an influence breathing out of her, such as we might suppose to come from Eve, when she was just made, and her Creator brought her to Adam, saying, Behold, here is a woman. Not that I would convey the idea of especial gentleness, grace, modesty, and shyness, but of a certain warm and rich characteristic, which seems, for the most part, to have refined a way out of the feminine system. And now, continued Zenobia, I must go and help get supper. Do you think you can be content, instead of figs, pineapples, and all the other delicacies of Adam's supper table, with tea and toast, and a certain modest supply of ham and tongue, which, with the instinct of a housewife, I brought hither in a basket? And there shall be bread and milk too, if the innocence of your taste demands it. The whole sisterhood now went about their domestic avocations, utterly declining our offers to assist, further by bringing wood for the kitchen fire from a huge pile in the backyard. After heaping up more than a sufficient quantity, we returned to the sitting room, drew our chairs close to the hearth, and began to talk over our prospects. Soon, with a tremendous stamping in the entry, appeared Silas Foster, lank, stalwart, uncouth, and grizzly-bearded, where he had been plowing until the depths of the snow rendered it impossible to draw a furrow. He greeted us in pretty much the same tone as if he were speaking to his oxen, took a quid from his iron tobacco box, pulled off his wet cowhide boots, and sat down before the fire in his stocking feet. The steam arose from his soaked garments, so that the stout yeoman looked vaporous and specter-like. "Well, folks," remarked Silas, "you'll be wishing yourselves back to town again, if this weather holds." And true enough, there was a look of gloom as the twilight fell silently and sadly out of the sky, its gray or sable flakes intermingling themselves with the fast descending snow. The storm, in its every aspect, was decidedly dreary. It seemed to have arisen for our especial behoof, a symbol of the cold, desolate, distrustful phantoms that invariably haunt the mind on the eve of adventurous enterprises, to warn us back with the boundaries of ordinary life. But our courage did not quail. We would not allow ourselves to be depressed by the snowdrift trailing past the window, any more than if it had been the sigh of a summer wind among rustling boughs. There have been few brighter seasons for us than that, if ever men might lawfully dream awake and give utterance to the wildest visions without dread of laughter or scorn on the part of the audience. Yes, and speak of earthly happiness for themselves and mankind as an object to be hopefully striven for, and probably attained. We who made that little semicircle around the blazing fire were those very men. We had left the rusty iron framework of society behind us. We had broken through many hindrances that are powerful enough to keep most people on the weary treadmill of the established system, even while they feel its irksomeness almost as intolerable as we did. We had stepped down from the pulpit. We had flung aside the pen. We had shut up the ledger. We had thrown off that sweat, bewitching, enervating indolence which is better, after all, than most of the enjoyments within mortal grasp. It was our purpose, a generous one, certainly, and absurd, no doubt, in full proportion with its generosity, to give up whatever we had heretofore attained for the sake of showing mankind the example of a life governed by other than the false and cruel principles on which human society has all been based. And first of all, we had divorced ourselves from pride and were striving to supply its place with familiar love. We meant to lessen the laboring man's great burden of toil by performing our due share of it at the cost of our own thews and sinews. We sought our profit by mutual aid instead of wresting it by the strong hand and from an enemy, or filching it craftily from those less shrewd than ourselves, if indeed there were any such in New England, or winning it by selfish competition with a neighbor. In one or another, which fashions every son of women, both perpetrates and suffers his share of the common evil, whether he chooses it or no. And as the basis of our institution, we purpose to offer up the earnest toil of our bodies as a prayer no less than an effort for an advancement of our race. Therefore, if we built splendid castles, phalansteries perhaps they might be more fitly called, and pictured beautiful scenes among the fervid coals of the hearth around which we were clustering, and if all went to rack with the crumbling embers, and have ever since arisen out of the ashes, let us take to ourselves no shame. In my own behalf, I rejoice that I could once think better of the world's improbability than it deserved. It is a mistake into which men seldom fall twice in a lifetime, or if so, the rarer and higher is the nature that can thus magnanimously persist in error. Stout Silas Foster mingled little in our conversation, but when he did speak, it was very much to some practical purpose. For instance, which man among you, quoth he, is the best judge of swine? Some of us must go to the next Brighton fair and buy 6 pigs. Pigs, good heavens! Had we come out from among the swinish multitude for this? And again, in reference to some discussion about raising early vegetables for the market, we shall never make any hand at market gardening, said Silas Foster, unless the women folks will undertake to do all the weeding. We haven't team enough for that and the regular farm work, reckoning 3 or 4 city folks as worth 1 common field hand. No, I tell you, we should have to get up a little too early in the morning to compete with the market gardeners around Boston. It struck me as rather odd that one of the first questions raised after our separation from the greedy, struggling, self-seeking world should relate to the possibility of getting the advantage over the outside barbarians in their own field of labor. But to own the truth, I very soon became sensible that, as regarded society at large, we stood in a position of new hostility rather than new brotherhood. Nor could this fail to be the case, in some degree, until the bigger and better half of society should range itself on our side. Constituting so pitiful a minority as now, we were inevitably estranged from the rest of mankind in pretty fair proportion with the strictness of our mutual bond among ourselves. This dawning idea, however, was driven back into my inner consciousness by the entrance of Zenobia. She came with the welcome intelligence that supper was on the table. Looking at herself in the glass and perceiving that her one magnificent flower had grown rather languid, probably by exposed to the fervency of the kitchen fire, she flung it on the floor, as unconcernedly as a village girl would throw away a faded violet. The action seemed proper to her character, although, methought, it would still more have befitted the bounteous nature of this beautiful woman to scatter fresh flowers from her hand and to revive faded ones by her touch. Nevertheless, it was a singular but irresistible effect. The presence of Zenobia caused our heroic enterprise to show like an illusion, a masquerade, a pastoral, a counterfeit Arcadia, in which we grown-up men and women were making a play day of the years that were given us to live in. I tried to analyze this impression, but not with much success. It really vexes me, observed Zenobia, as we left the room, that Mr. Hollingsworth should be such a laggard. I should not have thought him at all the sort of person to be turned back by a puff of contrary wind or a few snowflakes drifting into his face. Do you know Hollingsworth personally? I inquired. No, only as an auditress, of some of his lectures, said she. What a voice he has, and what a man he is, yet not so much an intellectual man, I should say, as a great heart. At least, he moved me more deeply than I think myself capable of being moved, except by the stroke of a true, strong heart against my own. It is a sad pity that he should have devoted his glorious powers to such a grimy, unbeautiful, and positively hopeless object as this reformation of criminals, about which he makes himself and his wretchedly small audiences so very miserable. To tell you a secret, I never could tolerate a philanthropist before. Could you? By no means, I answered. Neither can I now. They are indeed an odiously disagreeable set of mortals, continued Zenobia. I should like Mr. Hollingsworth a great deal better if the philanthropy had been left out. At all events, as a mere matter of taste, I wish he would let the bad people alone and try to befit those who are not already past his help. Do you suppose he will be content to spend his life, or even a few months of it, among tolerably virtuous and comfortable individuals like ourselves? Upon my word, I doubt it, said I. If we wish to keep him with us, we must systematically commit at least one crime apiece. Mere peccadillos will not satisfy him. Zenobia turned, sidelong, a strange kind of glance upon me, but before I could make out what it meant, we had entered the kitchen, where, in accordance with the rustic simplicity of our new life, the supper table was spread. Thank you for listening to Sleepy. Good night.